The morning mist clung to the cobblestone streets of Windsor like a shroud, masking the movements of a man who had been running for 3 years. Marcus Thornfield pressed his back against the cold brick wall of an alleyway, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. His withered hands trembled as he checked his watch. 6:47 a.m. In 13 minutes, the royal motorcade would pass through the main thoroughfare, and everything he had planned would either come to fruition or end in disaster. Marcus wasn't always a wanted man. 3 years ago, he had been Detective Inspector Marcus Thornfield of the Metropolitan Police, a decorated officer with 22 years of service and a spotless record. He had a wife named Sarah, 2 teenage children, and a modest home in Surrey. His life had been ordinary, predictable, and safe. But that was before he discovered the truth about Operation Nightfall, before he learned what really happened to the missing evidence in the Pemberton case, and before he realized that some of his closest colleagues were part of a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. The discovery had been accidental. Marcus had been working late one evening, reviewing cold cases in the basement archives of Scotland Yard. He had been looking for a file related to a robbery from 1998 when he stumbled upon a box that shouldn't have been there. Inside were photographs, documents, and recordings that painted a picture of corruption so vast and systematic that it made his stomach turn. Police officers, judges, politicians, and even members of the Royal Protection Unit were involved in a network that manipulated evidence, silenced witnesses, and protected criminals who paid the right price. At the center of it all was Chief Superintendent David Blackwood, Marcus's mentor and the man he had looked up to for over a decade. The evidence showed that Blackwood had been running the operation for years, using his position to orchestrate cover-ups and frame innocent people. The most damning piece of evidence was a recorded conversation between Blackwood and a member of Parliament, discussing how to eliminate a witness who threatened to expose their activities. That witness was a young mother named Claire Pemberton, who had supposedly died in a car accident 6 months earlier. Marcus had known Claire Pemberton personally. She had come to him with information about her brother's death, claiming that he had been murdered by corrupt officers rather than killed in the drug deal gone wrong that the official report suggested. Marcus had initially dismissed her claims as the desperate theories of a grieving sister, but the evidence in that hidden box proved that she had been right all along. More horrifying was the audio recording of her final phone call to Blackwood, where she pleaded for protection before her car mysteriously went off the road. That night, Marcus made photocopies of everything and hid them in a safety deposit box. He went home to his family, trying to appear normal while his mind raced with the implications of what he had discovered. He knew that going through official channels would be useless. Too many people in authority positions were compromised. He needed to find another way to expose the truth, but he had to be careful. If Blackwood and his network discovered what he knew, Marcus and his family would be in mortal danger. His caution proved justified when he returned to work the next morning to find his desk being searched by internal affairs officers. Someone had reported that he had been accessing files without authorization. Marcus maintained his innocence, but he could see the suspicion in their eyes. Blackwood appeared concerned and supportive, offering to help clear up the misunderstanding, but Marcus could now see through the facade. The man he had trusted and admired was calculating how much Marcus knew and how best to neutralize the threat he posed. Within a week, Marcus found himself suspended from duty pending an investigation into allegations of evidence tampering. The charges were elaborate and sophisticated, supported by falsified records and testimony from officers he had thought were friends. His wife Sarah struggled to understand what was happening. She had known Marcus for 15 years and couldn't believe that the honest, principled man she married could be capable of the crimes he was accused of. But the evidence against him seemed overwhelming, and doubt began to creep into her voice when she spoke to him. The breaking point came when Marcus discovered that his house was being watched. He noticed the same cars parked on his street, the same faces in the coffee shop he frequented, and phone conversations that cut off abruptly when he entered a room. When he confronted Sarah about it, she broke down and admitted that officers had visited her at work. They had told her that Marcus was dangerous, that he might harm her and the children if he felt cornered. They offered to relocate the family for their safety, separating them from Marcus permanently. That evening, as Marcus sat in his study looking at family photographs, he received a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was electronically disguised, but the message was clear: stop looking into things that don't concern you, or your family will pay the price. This is your only warning. The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at the phone in horror. They weren't just threatening his career anymore, they were threatening the people he loved most in the world. Marcus knew he had two choices: abandon his investigation and hope they would leave his family alone, or take the evidence public and risk everything. The decision was made for him the next morning when he received a call from his lawyer. New evidence had surfaced that directly implicated Marcus in the murder of Claire Pemberton. A witness claimed to have seen him near her car on the night she died, and forensic evidence supposedly linked him to the scene. The charges would be upgraded to first-degree murder, and an arrest warrant would be issued within hours. In that moment, Marcus realized that Blackwood and his network had played their final card. They weren't just going to destroy his career, they were going to frame him for the very murder that had exposed their corruption. If he stayed and fought the charges through legal channels, he would spend the rest of his life in prison while the real criminals walked free. His only option was to run, gather more evidence, and find a way to expose the truth from outside the system. The decision to flee was the hardest one Marcus had ever made. He called Sarah from a payphone and told her that he was innocent, that he was being framed by corrupt officers who wanted to silence him. He could hear the confusion and fear in her voice as she struggled to process what he was telling her. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of evidence against him was overwhelming. When he asked her to bring the children and disappear with him, she couldn't bring herself to say yes. The man on the phone sounded like her husband, but everything she had been told suggested that he was dangerous and unstable. Marcus spent his last free hours gathering cash from various accounts and retrieving the evidence from his safety deposit box. As he drove away from everything he had ever known, he caught sight of his house in the rearview mirror. Police cars were already surrounding the property, and he could see Sarah standing in the doorway with their children, watching as officers searched their home for any clue to his whereabouts. The next 3 years were a blur of cheap motels, false identities, and constant movement. Marcus used his police training to stay ahead of his pursuers, but he never stopped gathering evidence. He made contact with other officers who had been silenced or discredited, pieced together the full scope of the conspiracy, and slowly built a case that would expose everyone involved. But he needed a platform, a way to ensure that the information would reach the public before it could be suppressed. The breakthrough came 6 months ago when Marcus learned about a royal visit to Windsor. The event would be heavily covered by international media, and security would be provided by the very protection unit that was part of Blackwood's network. Marcus realized that this was his chance. If he could create a dramatic enough scene, one that would force the media to pay attention, he could finally tell his story to the world. The plan was dangerous and desperate, but it was his only option after years of failed attempts to reach journalists, whistleblower organizations, and government oversight committees. Every avenue had been blocked by the network's influence, and Marcus was running out of time. His false identities were becoming harder to maintain, and he could feel the net closing around him with each passing day. Now, as he stood in the alley with his heart pounding, Marcus pulled out the weapon he had acquired through channels he never thought he would use. It wasn't loaded with bullets, he had no intention of harming anyone. Instead, it contained a modified cartridge designed to release a harmless but dramatic flash and smoke when fired. The real weapon in his possession was a USB drive containing 3 years of evidence, witness statements, and recorded confessions that would bring down the entire conspiracy. The sound of approaching motorcycles echoed through the morning air, and Marcus knew his moment was approaching. He thought of Sarah and his children, wondering if they would ever understand why he had done what he was about to do. He thought of Claire Pemberton and all the other victims whose deaths had been covered up by the network he was trying to expose. Most of all, he thought about the truth, the one thing that had driven him to sacrifice everything he held dear. As the royal motorcade came into view, Marcus stepped out of the alley and into the street. The lead motorcycle spotted him immediately, and, within seconds, armed officers were shouting commands and drawing their weapons. Among them, Marcus recognized the face of Sergeant James Morrison, one of Blackwood's key operatives and the man who had planted the evidence that framed him for murder. Marcus raised his weapon, not at the royal vehicle, but at Morrison specifically. In that frozen moment, as news cameras captured every detail and the world watched in shock, Marcus shouted the words he had been waiting 3 years to say. "James Morrison, you are under citizen's arrest for the murder of Claire Pemberton and conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. The evidence is in my left pocket, and the whole world is watching." The shot rang out across Windsor, filling the air with smoke and confusion. As chaos erupted around him, Marcus dropped his weapon and raised his hands, hoping that he had finally found a way to make the truth heard. But, in the pandemonium that followed, he could see Morrison's face clearly, and the expression there told him that the conspiracy was far from over. The final twist in this 3-year game of cat and mouse was about to begin. The smoke from Marcus's modified weapon had barely cleared when Sergeant James Morrison took control of the situation with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been preparing for this moment. While other officers secured the scene and attended to the royal motorcade, Morrison moved quickly toward Marcus, who was now face down on the cobblestones with his hands zip-tied behind his back. "Search him thoroughly," Morrison commanded the approaching officers. "This man is extremely dangerous and has been planning this attack for months. Check for explosives, additional weapons, and any intelligence materials." Marcus felt hands roughly searching his jacket, and his heart sank as one officer pulled out the USB drive that contained his evidence. Morrison's eyes lit up as he recognized the device, and he quickly pocketed it before anyone else could see what it contained. To the other officers, it looked like standard procedure, but Marcus understood that his 3 years of work had just been confiscated by the very man he was trying to expose. "Did you find anything?" asked Inspector Helen Bradley, who had arrived moments after the incident. She was one of the few officers Marcus still trusted, someone who had always maintained her integrity despite the corruption around her. "Just this," Morrison replied, holding up a decoy drive that he had planted on Marcus during the search. "Probably contains his manifesto or demands. We'll need to analyze it carefully for any terrorist connections." As Marcus was loaded into an armored police van, he caught sight of the media circus that was already forming around the incident. News helicopters circled overhead, and reporters were setting up their equipment behind police barriers. The story was already being shaped by Morrison and his colleagues, who were describing the incident as a terrorist attack on the royal family rather than the desperate act of a whistleblower trying to expose the truth. The van ride to the detention center gave Marcus time to think about what had gone wrong. He had expected Morrison to be present at the royal protection detail, but he hadn't anticipated how quickly the man would react to secure the evidence. Marcus's backup plan had always been to ensure that the USB drive would be discovered during his arrest and processed through normal channels, where honest officers might recognize its significance. But Morrison's quick thinking had eliminated that possibility. The interrogation began within an hour of Marcus's arrival at the high-security facility. He was placed in a windowless room with fluorescent lights that buzzed constantly overhead. The table was bolted to the floor, and cameras monitored every angle of the space. Marcus had been through countless interrogations during his police career, but being on the other side of the table was a surreal and frightening experience. Morrison entered the room with Detective Chief Inspector Patricia Vance, a woman Marcus had worked with years earlier on several major cases. She had always been ambitious and willing to bend rules to advance her career, but Marcus wasn't sure if she was part of the conspiracy or simply an opportunist looking to make her mark on a high-profile case. "Well, Marcus," Morrison said as he sat down across from him. 3 years is a long time to be running. You must be exhausted." Marcus remained silent, knowing that anything he said would be twisted against him. He had been read his rights, but he also knew that the normal legal protections didn't apply when you were dealing with corrupt officers who controlled the system from within. "You've caused a lot of trouble," Vance added, opening a thick file that contained Marcus's fabricated criminal history. "The evidence against you is overwhelming. The murder of Claire Pemberton, the theft of classified materials, and now this attack on the royal family. You're looking at life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." Morrison leaned forward with a cold smile. "Unless, of course, you're willing to cooperate. Tell us who helped you plan this attack, where you've been hiding for the past 3 years, and what other operations you have planned. If you're honest with us, we might be able to arrange for a more comfortable situation." Marcus understood the implicit threat. They weren't offering him a plea bargain, they were offering him the choice between a life sentence in general population, where corrupt guards could arrange for his suicide, or a slightly longer life in protective custody where he would be effectively silenced but allowed to live. Neither option involved exposing the truth about the conspiracy. "I want to speak to Inspector Bradley," Marcus finally said. "She's the only officer I trust to handle this case objectively." Morrison and Vance exchanged a look that confirmed Marcus's suspicions about their involvement in the conspiracy. "Inspector Bradley has been reassigned," Morrison replied smoothly. "She had a conflict of interest due to her previous relationship with you. DCI Vance and I will be handling your case personally." The interrogation continued for hours, with Morrison and Vance taking turns trying to break Marcus down psychologically. They showed him photographs of his family, his old home, and his former colleagues, constantly reminding him of everything he had lost by pursuing his investigation. They painted a picture of a man driven mad by paranoid delusions, someone who had invented an elaborate conspiracy theory to justify his own criminal behavior. "Your wife has filed for divorce," Vance said during one particularly brutal session. "She's also requested a restraining order to protect herself and your children from any contact with you. She told the court that she doesn't recognize the man you've become and fears for their safety if you ever get out of prison." The words hit Marcus harder than any physical blow could have. He had always hoped that Sarah would eventually understand why he had done what he did, that she would realize he had been trying to protect their family from a system that was fundamentally corrupt. To learn that she had completely turned against him was devastating, but it also strengthened his resolve. If he had lost his family anyway, then exposing the truth became even more important. During a brief break in the interrogation, Marcus was returned to his cell to find an unexpected visitor waiting for him. Chief Superintendent David Blackwood sat on the narrow bench, looking every inch the distinguished police officer who had mentored Marcus for over a decade. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his uniform immaculate, and his expression carried the gravitas that had made him one of the most respected figures in law enforcement. "Hello, Marcus," Blackwood said in the paternal tone that had once made Marcus feel secure and valued. "You look terrible. 3 years of running will do that to a man." Marcus sat down on the opposite end of the bench, studying the face of the man who had orchestrated his destruction. Up close, he could see the calculated coldness behind Blackwood's practiced expressions of concern. "I suppose you're here to gloat," Marcus said quietly. Blackwood shook his head sadly. "I'm here because I still care about you, despite everything you've done. You were like a son to me, Marcus. Do you remember when you first joined my unit? You were so eager, so idealistic. You really believed you could make a difference in the world." "I still believe that," Marcus replied. "That's why I'm here." "Is it?" Blackwood asked, leaning forward slightly. "Or are you here because you couldn't accept that the world is more complicated than your simple moral code? You discovered that sometimes good people have to make difficult choices, that sometimes the greater good requires sacrifices that idealists can't stomach." Marcus felt his anger rising, but he forced himself to remain calm. "You call murder and corruption the greater good?" "I call it pragmatism," Blackwood replied. "Do you think crime just magically decreases because we arrest petty dealers and write reports? Do you think justice is served when guilty men walk free because of technicalities and bureaucratic incompetence? Sometimes what greater good was served by murdering an innocent woman?" For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Blackwood's face, regret, perhaps, or simply annoyance at having his methods questioned. Claire Pemberton was going to destroy dozens of investigations and put hundreds of criminals back on the street. Her brother wasn't an innocent victim, he was a drug dealer who had information that could have compromised years of undercover work. Sometimes one person has to die so that many others can live. "You don't get to make that choice," Marcus said firmly. "No one gave you the authority to decide who lives and who dies." Blackwood stood up, straightening his uniform with practiced precision. "Authority is taken, not given, Marcus. That's something you never understood. You always wanted someone else to give you permission to do what needed to be done." As he moved toward the door, Blackwood paused and looked back at Marcus with an expression of genuine sadness. "I really did hope you would see reason eventually. You could have had a distinguished career, a comfortable retirement, a legacy of real accomplishment. Instead, you chose this. I chose the truth, Marcus replied. You chose martyrdom, Blackwood corrected. And, martyrs are only useful after they're dead. The door closed with a final sounding click, leaving Marcus alone with the implication of those words. He understood now that they had never intended to simply imprison him. The plan had always been to arrange for his death in custody, probably making it look like suicide brought on by guilt and despair. The only question was when and how they would do it. That night, as Marcus lay on his narrow cot staring at the ceiling, he thought about the USB drive that Morrison had confiscated. It contained not just evidence of the conspiracy, but also the names and contact information of other officers who had been investigating similar corruption in their own departments. If Morrison and his colleagues gained access to that information, they could identify and eliminate everyone who posed a threat to their network. Marcus had spent 3 years gathering allies and building a case that went far beyond his own situation. There were honest officers in departments across the country who had been quietly documenting instances of corruption, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation. The USB drive contained a map of systemic corruption that reached from local police stations all the way to the highest levels of government. In the wrong hands, it would become a hit list. As he drifted off to an uneasy sleep, Marcus was haunted by the faces of all the people who had trusted him with their secrets and evidence. Claire Pemberton had died because she tried to expose the truth. How many others would follow her into the grave because of his failed attempt to make their sacrifices meaningful? The answer to that question would depend on whether his backup plan worked, and whether the one person he had never told about his investigation would prove as trustworthy as he hoped. In less than 24 hours, Marcus would discover whether his years of preparation had been enough to ensure that the truth would survive even if he didn't. The morning light filtering through the small window of Marcus's cell carried with it the sound of unusual activity in the corridor outside. Footsteps echoed with more urgency than normal, and he could hear fragments of hushed conversations between guards. Something had changed overnight, and the atmosphere in the detention facility felt charged with tension that hadn't been there during his first day in custody. Marcus was still trying to make sense of the sounds when his cell door opened to reveal a figure he had never expected to see again. Inspector Helen Bradley stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 officers Marcus didn't recognize. Her face was grim, but there was something in her eyes that gave him the first spark of hope he had felt since his arrest. Marcus Thornfield, you're being transferred to a new facility for your own protection, she announced in an official tone. But, as she said it, she made a subtle gesture with her left hand, a signal they had used during undercover operations years ago that meant play alone, but stay alert. The transfer van that waited outside was different from the standard police transport Marcus had expected. It was unmarked and civilian in appearance, though he could see the telltale signs of armor plating and reinforced glass. As he was helped into the back seat, Bradley climbed in beside him while the 2 unknown officers took positions in the front. "What's happening?" Marcus asked quietly as the van pulled away from the facility. "Your friend Morrison made a mistake," Bradley replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "He tried to access the information on that USB drive using a police computer, and our cybersecurity division flagged it as suspicious. When they examined the contents, they found evidence of corruption that goes far beyond anything they had imagined." Marcus felt his heart rate increase. The backup plan he had built into the USB drive had worked exactly as intended. The device contained not just his evidence, but also a sophisticated tracking program that would alert certain trusted contacts if anyone tried to access the files without proper authorization. Those contacts included several officers in internal affairs departments across the country who had been quietly investigating similar cases of corruption. "Morrison doesn't know that we intercepted a copy of the files," Bradley continued. "He thinks he successfully buried your evidence, and his network is proceeding with their plan to eliminate you. But now we have independent confirmation of everything you've been claiming for the past 3 years." The van was traveling through parts of London that Marcus didn't recognize, taking a circuitous route that suggested they were being. Bank records showed millions of pounds flowing through offshore accounts controlled by corrupt officers. Surveillance reports detailed systematic intimidation of judges, prosecutors, and witnesses. Most damning of all were transcripts of recorded conversations in which senior officials discussed the elimination of problematic individuals with the casual tone of people ordering lunch. "There's something else," Bradley said, lowering her voice even further. "Your wife Sarah isn't safe. Morrison's people have been watching her, and they intercepted communications suggesting that she knows more about your investigation than she's admitted. They think you might have shared evidence with her before you fled." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He had been so careful to keep his family out of his investigation, never telling them about the evidence he had gathered or the danger they all faced. But Sarah was intelligent and observant. She might have noticed things without realizing their significance. If Morrison's network believed she posed a threat, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate her just as they had eliminated Claire Pemberton. "Where is she now?" Marcus asked urgently. "We moved her and the children to a safe house 3 hours ago," Bradley replied. "They don't know about the transfer yet, and they're still confused about what's happening. Sarah thinks she's being protected from you, not from the people who framed you." The van turned into an underground parking garage beneath a nondescript office building. As they descended into the depths of the structure, Marcus could see armed officers positioned at strategic points, their faces hidden behind tactical masks. This wasn't a standard police operation, it had the feel of something much more serious and secretive. They were escorted to an elevator that descended far below the building's apparent ground level. When the doors opened, Marcus found himself in a sophisticated command center that looked more like something from a spy thriller than a police facility. Multiple computer screens displayed surveillance footage, communication intercepts, and complex organizational charts that mapped out the corruption network he had been fighting. "Welcome to Operation Clearwater," Bradley said as they entered the main briefing room. "It's a joint task force between multiple agencies that have been investigating systemic corruption in law enforcement. Your evidence was the missing piece we needed to understand the full scope of the problem." Around the conference table sat representatives from agencies Marcus had never thought he would see working together. There were officers from internal affairs departments, investigators from the Serious Fraud Office, agents from the National Crime Agency, and several people in civilian clothes who were introduced only by first names. The diversity of the group suggested that the corruption had become so widespread that multiple agencies had been forced to collaborate in secret to combat it. "The situation has reached a critical point," announced a woman identified only as Director Walsh. "Morrison and his network are preparing to implement what they call the final protocol, a systematic elimination of all threats to their operations. Your arrest was supposed to be the beginning of that process, but your evidence has allowed us to identify their targets before they can be reached." A large screen on the wall displayed a map of the United Kingdom marked with dozens of red dots. Each dot, Marcus learned, represented someone who was scheduled for elimination over the next 72 hours. The list included police officers, journalists, judges, and civil servants who had been asking uncomfortable questions or gathering dangerous information. "We have intercepted communications indicating that the network plans to stage these deaths as accidents, suicides, or random crimes," Director Walsh continued. "The scale of what they're planning is unprecedented in modern British history. If we don't stop them in the next few days, dozens of innocent people will die, and the corruption will become so deeply embedded that it may never be rooted out." Marcus studied the faces around the table, noting the grim determination in their expressions. These were people who had dedicated their careers to upholding justice, and they were facing the reality that their own institutions had been compromised to an almost unimaginable degree. "What do you need from me?" Marcus asked. "We need you to do something incredibly dangerous," Bradley replied. "Morrison and his network believe you're still in their custody and that your evidence has been destroyed. They don't know about this operation, and we need to keep it that way until we can move against all of them simultaneously." Director Walsh activated another screen that showed surveillance footage of the detention facility where Marcus had been held. "We've replaced you with a body double, someone who can pass for you from a distance and in poor lighting conditions. The network is planning to stage your suicide tonight, believing that your death will close the final chapter of their investigation troubles." Marcus understood immediately what they were asking of him. "You want me to attend my own murder?" "We want you to help us catch them in the act," Bradley corrected. With proper backup and surveillance, we can document their methods and gather evidence that will be admissible in court. But it requires you to put yourself in extreme danger, and there are no guarantees about the outcome. The plan they outlined was complex and risky. Marcus would be returned to the detention facility through a secret entrance, replacing his body double before Morrison arrived to carry out the execution. Hidden cameras and microphones would record everything that happened, providing irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy. Meanwhile, simultaneous operations would be launched against other members of the network across the country, preventing them from escaping once they realized their activities had been exposed. "There's one more thing," Director Walsh added as the briefing concluded. "We've analyzed the financial records from your evidence, and we've discovered that the corruption extends beyond law enforcement. Several members of parliament, senior civil servants, and even judges have been receiving payments from the network. Exposing this conspiracy is going to create a political crisis that could bring down the government." Marcus felt the weight of that revelation settling on his shoulders. He had always known that the corruption went beyond his immediate colleagues, but the idea that it reached the highest levels of government was staggering. The decision to proceed with the operation would affect not just law enforcement, but the entire political system of the country. As he sat in the command center surrounded by people who were risking their careers to support his fight for justice, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. 3 years ago, he had been an ordinary detective trying to solve a routine case. The discovery of corruption had cost him his family, his career, and nearly his life. But it had also led to this moment, where his sacrifice might finally serve a purpose greater than his own vindication. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was about to voluntarily walk into a situation designed to kill him. But, for the first time since this nightmare began, Marcus felt that he had allies who understood what was at stake and were willing to fight alongside him. The question now was whether their plan would work, or whether Morrison and his network were too sophisticated and ruthless to be caught by conventional means. As evening approached and the time for the operation drew near, Marcus prepared himself for what might be his final confrontation with the forces that had destroyed his old life. He thought of Claire Pemberton and all the other victims whose deaths he was trying to make meaningful. Most of all, he thought of his family and hoped that someday they would understand that everything he had done was in service of a truth larger than any of them had imagined. The detention facility at night was a different world from the bustling institutional environment Marcus had experienced during the day. Fluorescent lights hummed in empty corridors, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move with their own malevolent purpose. As Marcus made his way through the service tunnels beneath the building, guided by Bradley and her team, he could feel the weight of the surveillance equipment hidden beneath his clothing and the knowledge that his every move was being monitored by dozens of people in the command center. The body double who had been impersonating him was extracted through the same tunnel system, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the man as they passed in the narrow underground passage. The resemblance was uncanny, similar height and build, the same weathered features that 3 years of running had carved into Marcus's face. It was disturbing to see what amounted to his own corpse walking past him in the dim light. "Remember," Bradley whispered as they reached the access point to his cell block, "Morrison will try to make this look like suicide, but he's too careful to do it himself. He'll bring muscle with him, probably someone from outside the regular force structure. Don't try to be heroic, let them think they're in control until our backup arrives." Marcus nodded, though his throat felt too tight to speak. The earpiece hidden in his ear canal would allow him to hear updates from the command center, but he wouldn't be able to communicate back without risking exposure. Once he was back in his cell, he would be effectively alone until the operation concluded one way or another. The cell looked exactly as he had left it that morning, down to the position of the thin mattress on the metal cot and the scratches he had noticed on the concrete wall. Marcus lay down and tried to control his breathing as he waited for Morrison to arrive. The digital clock on the wall read 11:47 p.m., and intelligence suggested that the execution was scheduled for sometime after midnight when the facility would be operating with minimal staff. Through his earpiece, Marcus could hear the controlled chaos of the command center as Operation Clearwater unfolded across the country. Teams were moving into position near the homes and offices of other targets, waiting for coordinated arrests that would prevent the network from warning each other once the operation began. The stakes were enormous. If even one member of the conspiracy escaped the initial sweep, they could trigger emergency protocols that might result in the deaths of witnesses and the destruction of evidence. At 12:23 a.m., Marcus heard footsteps approaching his cell. His heart rate spiked as he recognized the measured cadence of Morrison's walk, accompanied by the heavier tread of at least two other people. Through the small window in his cell door, he could see shadows moving in the corridor as the group prepared for what they believed would be a routine elimination. The door opened with a soft electronic beep, and Morrison entered, followed by two men. Marcus